In 1996, the first mammal was cloned, Dolly the sheep. Dolly was an exact copy of her mother in every possible way. From that point, it was only a matter of time before the ability to clone a human being would become a reality. Ever since the cloning of Dolly, the debates of this highly charged issue on whether or not to clone human beings has raged with ever-increasing fury and intensity. While there has yet to be any consensus, mandate resolution or regulations governing this brand new technology. While many people have considered this technology as nothing less than playing God, others regard it merely as scientific and medical progress, and so goes the great human cloning debate. This program presents both sides of this debate, so that people may be able to decide for themselves if they want to play God and clone humans.
If you think of the developments in medicine that have occurred in the last 50 years or 100 years that we all take for granted, like anesthetics, antibiotics, organ transplantation, and the contribution that they've made to human health and well-being, then we're very confident that in the future there will be even more opportunities than have been developed in the last 100 years.
Cloning, once thought of as wild science fiction fantasy, has now become a reality, and the related moral, ethical, and religious issues surrounding this scientific advancement are struggling to catch up with this new technology. Some other closely related technologies that seemed scientifically impossible at the turn of the last century, such as organ transplants and in vitro fertilization, are commonplace practices today. Over time, yesterday's science fiction fantasy often becomes present-day scientific fact. In the process, cultural and political attitudes usually evolve to accommodate the advancements. The moral, ethical, and religious debates concerning cloning, however, have spawned public fury and controversy unseen since the civil rights demonstrations of the 1960s. In addition, science itself continues to be divided on whether we should proceed with human cloning. Within this debate, there appears to be a clear-cut distinction between the cloning of a full-term human being and the cloning of human cells for tissue and organ growth and research. Is cloning a full-term human being a concept better left alone? Or is our curiosity and desire to manipulate and control our genes just human nature and a part of the human design? And with regards to cloning technology, can human beings be relied upon to draw the correct proverbial line between morally and ethically appropriate uses and those decidedly improper or even sinister? As humankind continues its venture into the realm of human cloning, these and many more weighty questions arise.
Cloning is a word that is a broad word. It's applied to plants and animals, but with respect to humans, it's a new way of originating a person, such that you would take a cell, any cell from the human body, take its nucleus out, take an egg, take its nucleus out, put the new nucleus in, put a tiny spark to make them fuse, and it would form a human embryo, and if things work out, you put the embryo back into a woman's uterus, it would gestate and become a human being.
Less than a century ago, people were horrified by the artificial insemination of animals. Later, people were again horrified when organ transplantation was developed, and even more so when animal organs were transplanted into humans. Most recently, the birth of the first test tube baby, Louise Brown, where an egg was fertilized outside her mother's womb, then implanted, created a storm of religious and ethical protests and controversy. Today, however, people don't think twice at the mention of in vitro fertilization, and now consider all of these medical technologies as simply tools in benefiting humanity.
In vitro fertilization, although the clergy has struggled with the idea, we have come to the understanding that, again, that is an appropriate way of producing life if that's the only way that it can be made. And as far as putting organs into human beings from animals, if that saves a human life, that is also an appropriate form of transplant. But to clone an individual would mean that we no longer need marriages. We no longer need men and women to get together and to become a couple.
Is a cloned carbon copy of an organism, however, a good thing? A human clone would be an exact copy of an individual in every physical and genetic aspect.
I think the argument from science is that many people in science think a child originated by cloning is simply a delayed twin, period. And all the other stuff is science fiction emotionalism. Science hates to close down options, especially if they're based on ignorance and prejudice. There are things that people originated by cloning might actually teach us.
Any technology has its good side and its bad side. And if you take a good technology, one that appears to be mostly good, and you put a low consciousness scientist or person, politician, if that person is coming from a place of greed and seeking power, etc., a low consciousness will take a good technology and corrupt it. However, if there's a technology that appears to be maybe dangerous or bad, and you take a high consciousness person with good intentions who takes into account all types of ethical considerations, then they can actually take a technology that may seem more dangerous and turn it in a good direction.
The initial attitudes towards and directions taken in human cloning technology were undoubtedly influenced by the early pioneers of mammal cloning. In 1996, British embryologist Dr. Ian Wilmot was the first scientist to successfully clone a mammal. In that case, a sheep was cloned, and its offspring was named Dolly. Overnight, Dolly became the icon of cloning, a crowning achievement to some, and the edge of nightmarish possibilities for others.
We use sheep for our research in developing this technique because there are many ways in which it would be useful to copy farm animals, and we were very confident that the technique that works in sheep would also work effectively in cattle, and that has of course proved to be the case.
This is Dolly. Dolly was cloned from a mammary gland cell taken from a 6-year-old ewe. That cell was cultured in the laboratory for several weeks, and then it was transferred to an egg from which the maternal DNA had been removed. And that created what we call a reconstructed embryo. That embryo is activated by a small electric shock, and in a small proportion of cases, those embryos develop normally.
Before Dolly, scientists believed that the genetic material or DNA of cells was differentiated, that is, locked into being, whatever it was, muscle or skin or bone or soft tissue, although it contained all the blueprints required to build an entire organism. The discovery that the genetic material of a differentiated cell could be made to behave like an egg or a sperm was a remarkable breakthrough that had applications for use in virtually all mammals, including humans.
The remarkable thing about all this is that people, each step of the way, have said, this won't happen. And within a couple months, it happened. When I started out in 1997, there was a textbook on mammalian physiology that said it was a law of nature that once cells become differentiated, they cannot become undifferentiated again. And what Ian Wilmot basically did is prove that that law of nature was false.
With the huge success of Dolly, Wilmot inadvertently offered a method that theoretically could be followed to ultimately clone a human. As soon as the news of Dolly broke, along with the implications for human cloning, President Clinton launched an immediate 90-day study of the cloning issue by the National Bioethics Advisory Committee. The Clinton and Gore administration stated that any discovery that touches upon human creation is not simply a matter of scientific inquiry. It is a matter of morality and spirituality as well. Each human life is unique, born of a miracle that reaches beyond laboratory science.
President Clinton was a politician, and he was responding to the immediate yuck factor people had when there's something like this. You have to look at where that public response came from. If you look at movies, at science fiction, there are dozens of movies that portray scientists as improperly motivated, going back to Frankenstein.
Here's this doctor, Dr. Frankenstein, who makes this monster that terrifies people. And that's kind of the concept that people have, that the scientists are doing these horrendous things. I mean, if the concept is only do research that's going to turn out to be good for mankind, only do research that's going to be perfect and good for mankind, any other research is not acceptable, you might as well forget it. We're going to be back in caves.
Ever since the Clinton administration questioned the pursuit of human cloning research, the moral and ethical debate has raged on with ever-increasing frenzy. There were immediate moratoriums on research with human embryos and bans on government funding of human cloning research. Several countries have even passed laws preventing such research to continue. However, some believe that even a near-global ban would not stop someone, somewhere, from eventually cloning a full-term human being.
It probably won't be done in this country. Actually, they asked me about this in the New York Times a couple weeks ago, and I said that they asked me, would an American clone a human? And I said that person would be known as the Kevorkian of reproduction. So you wouldn't want to do it in this country. It would destroy your career because society's not ready for it. But the technology's there, and it will be done in other countries.
But what happens in the rest of the world, in India or Pakistan or Indonesia, we can't control. And it's my view that one of those countries, which probably feels a little bit insecure compared to superpower America, is going to do that to show that it has a place at the world table. And it'll be a spectacular achievement.
Perhaps the most useful potential benefit to humanity of human cloning would be as an alternative option to in vitro fertilization.
The only practical reason to clone someone, to clone a human being, not to clone for tissue, but to clone a human being, would be in a couple that was infertile, or a person who was infertile and had no chance of having gametes. So you could use their somatic cells in order to make a human being. So that could bring the joy of having a child to that couple or that individual.
And when you keep going back to saying, look, you have to use in vitro fertilization to do this, it's not a very efficient technology. Only 18 people out of 100 take home a baby. Most states do not reimburse for in vitro fertilization. It costs $8,000 an attempt. Most of the people that use it are not going to be interested in cloning. And you begin to see this is not a technology that many people will ever use and would not produce very many babies. Once you do that, it doesn't seem quite so scary.
What is scaring many governments, organizations, and clergy of all political and religious traditions is the apparent lack of rules and regulations and controls governing such a new technology. They are loudly voicing their opposition to full-term human cloning. Many oppose genetic research, such as cloning, that produces waste embryos and fetuses. The moral concern over waste human embryos and fetuses certainly has merit. Taking the cloning of Dolly as a prime example, nearly 300 embryos were created, then destroyed, and 4 of the 5 clones created along with Dolly went to full term, but all of Dolly's siblings died at birth or soon after.
So, you know, people say, well, Ian Wilmot, you know, a lot of embryos were used to create Dolly. Big deal. I mean, I don't think embryos count. The technique's going to get better. It's going to get better. And I mean, some people care about embryos, but, you know, a fetus that miscarries, that's a different question. But an embryo, it's not a big deal.
These lost embryos and full-term fetuses may be a risk people are willing to take when it comes to animals, but it is quite another consideration when it comes to human beings.
One of the practical problems with cloning, of course, is it's still experimental technology. And I think Ian Wilnut took 277 tries to get Dolly. There were a few that took and then died, but Dolly was the only one who survived to term. And plainly, there's a huge practical, ethical issue here. If we jump the species barrier to human beings, are we going to fertilize hundreds of human eggs in the cloning technique in order to get one survivor? I think most people would be repulsed by that suggestion.
I think most people don't know the difference between therapeutic embryo cloning and adult cloning. But there are some people who believe that embryos are tiny human beings and are very passionate about not letting this go forward.
Our objective is to get away from the need to use human eggs and therefore to create very early stage embryos. But nobody under any circumstances should be, in our view, allowed to implant those eggs so that they could grow into an embryo and through full development into a baby, into a person. That's where we think the line should be drawn right now, and indeed is in many countries, including the UK.
One of the questions here is whether embryos count. In sexual reproduction, about half of embryos fail to implant. So we sometimes have a false view that every embryo becomes a person. In vitro fertilization, to create 18 babies probably takes 900 embryos. It's not a statistic that most people know about. It's a very inefficient procedure. A lot of embryos are wasted. No one objects to that. No one at all.
Interestingly, the one international treaty on bioethics is the European Convention on Biomedicine and Human Rights, which has now been signed onto by many European countries. And it does specifically prohibit the creation of human embryos for research. And it was drafted before cloning became a possibility, and therefore it's been amended to ban human cloning in the sense of cloned babies.
Therefore, the political and moral arguments seem to assert that although cloning technology currently exists, we should not be attempting to clone full-term human beings. Supporters of this point of view include the pioneers of cloning.
Each person, each child should be wanted as an individual. And if you set out to make a copy of somebody who is here, you're saying that you want the new baby to be like that person. And that is not a fair thing to do to a child. That summarizes the problems very, very succinctly. But it's for that reason that I don't think that there is any suggested proposal to make a copy of somebody who is here that any of us are comfortable with.
As we proceed in human genetics, I think we should have a rigid oversight process with regard to the ethics, because clearly we are dealing with such fundamental issues here that the more rigorous the ethical oversight, the better off science will be and the public will be. Then at least they can have the reassurance that what is occurring is in their best interest.
The possibility of human cloning also raises many other serious questions. Is the newborn infant a bag of biodata, an automated commodity programmed to grow, reproduce, and die? Would cloning humans perpetuate such a notion? Many argue that cloning undermines the uniqueness of the individual, raising profound religious and ethical questions.
Within the biblical worldview, which Jews and Christians and also Muslims hold to, and which in fact is a worldview shared in many dimensions here by other religious traditions as well, it's very hard to see how human cloning can have a place, because it represents a watershed in our interference in human procreation, not simply by helping out, as in assisted reproduction generally, but of course by supplanting it with a photocopying manufacture process.
Well, as far as the Bible is concerned, the Judaic Christian belief is that an embryo is considered to be a life. To make a human being the way we know it today, it takes two people. It takes a man and a woman, an egg and the sperm combined together. That is what God gave us the ability to do. Once we decide to eliminate that and we start doing for ourselves without God's intervention, we feel that we become like God and we become God ourselves. And once man starts to think that he is God, he will eventually destroy himself.
Further, it's argued that cloning is subject to gross abuse by the scientific community. Some assert that certain avenues should be off limits to science, and if scientists are not willing to draw the line for themselves, it's up to elected representatives to do it for them.
Our evidence is that scientists, like everybody else, can be tempted, and the temptation would be very strong for commercial reasons, reasons of scientific achievement and so on, to try and improve the human race. And then we get into a whole sci-fi scenario which really isn't very far ahead of us, and which I think most of us don't want to get into.
What I've seen the pattern is that corruption and abuse have leaked in everywhere. No matter how much it attempts to be regulated, no matter how much ethics is brought up, no matter what type of constraints are put on scientists or federal funding is pulled, the bottom line is that corruption is going to leak in and abuse is. I think what we're really speaking of here is eugenics. And eugenics is basically the science of improvement of the human race through better breeding. It's through the precise choosing of traits and characteristics that we judge to be superior to others.
In the early 20th century, 30 states in the United States adopted eugenics laws requiring citizens to be sterilized with conditions thought to be inheritable, such as insanity, criminal tendencies, retardation, and epilepsy. Similar laws were also enacted in other countries, including Germany in 1933 when Adolf Hitler came into power. It's well known that Hitler himself had a true desire to be cloned, along with his master race, and desperately wanted to develop cloning technology as an added tool to accomplish his goals.
Hitler judged himself to be an expert at knowing what was superior and what was inferior. And he took that to a place where he actually had intentions of wanting to filter out from the human race people that he thought were inferior, and he wanted to utilize eugenics in terms of creating a superior race. And we all know where that led to the murder and annihilation of millions and millions of people.
That would be naive to say that there's nothing to fear. I mean, there's some fear there. I think the fear is exaggerated and played upon. I mean, you know, they make lots of monster movies about biology. I mean, nobody makes monster movies about business or law.
In any event, while many consider this fear of the potential abuse of human cloning technology to be without merit, still others worry about a future dictator who fancies the idea of populating the world with a new race of genetically superior people.
Anything can be misused. I mean, it's a technology. I mean, hip replacements can be misused. I don't think things like cloning are not good or bad. I mean, it's a technology. It's a piece of knowledge.
The Europeans, partly because of the more religious character of public policy in Europe. Europeans don't go to church, but they want their public policy to reflect the Judeo-Christian tradition. And also the significance of Germany and the German conscience, because the Germans know all about science gone wrong. They know not to trust scientists any more than anybody else. They know that in their history, they essentially hold the key to the conscience of the future of Europe. And so in Germany, I mean, the Greens and the Christian Democrats and everybody in between agree on a lot of these issues. So they banned cloning in Germany 10 years ago.
Also within the realm of possibilities are health risks resulting from gene mutation, making full-term human cloning a dangerous exercise, especially in the early research stages. While cloning may produce a perfect infant, it may also produce a child that is genetically damaged, along with hundreds of waste embryos and fetuses. Who is going to accept responsibility for their creation and destruction?
Let me make one thing extremely clear, and here I'm speaking both for the Roslin Institute and for Geron and Geron Biomed. We do not see any justification for anyone using this technology to copy people, to make identical copies of people, or as a reproductive mechanism or technique. We just don't think it's right, and we don't think anyone should be trying it. We think it's dangerous, whether even if it was right. We think it's extremely dangerous and no one should do it.
In addition, it's feared that this technology applied to human beings would duplicate and magnify the genetic defects of the mother, passing them down to future generations. In other words, diversity in the gene pool would cease to exist, as could the species, if uncontrolled and unregulated cloning of full-term human beings was carried out in the future. Some other more radical possible uses of human cloning technology could in fact be Frankenstein-like in nature, should this technology be used by unscrupulous and corrupt individuals and corporations. Consider, for example, the idea of creating a clone or a brain-dead human copy to use as an incubator in which to grow perfectly matched organs or tissues for transplants, or even to have a new body created in which to transplant another person's brain. Such science fiction-like scenarios, though almost too horrific to contemplate, loom just beyond the horizon.
The ethical discussion would somebody who was very wealthy clone someone so that they were exactly the same as they were as far as immunologic factors, and they would take organs from that person so that they could live longer. That's the ethical consideration.
There are many ways in which medical science can advance cures and other benefits to humankind. The notion that it can properly do that through essentially using human beings for vivisection purposes, I think is still very shocking to a lot of people, and for some rather good reasons.
Okay, this is the common fallacy, that you would clone, a millionaire or somebody would clone their own genotypes they later use as an organ source. I mean, you can't kill people for their organs. You can't take their organs out. Identical twin can't rip a kidney out of his brother and take it. And so that copy of the millionaire's genotype is going to have free will, pain, feelings. He's going to want to live. He's not going to want to be an organ resource. And so it would be murder to do that.
Yes, that's fun to think about, or titillating to think about, but the truth is nobody's going to do that. I mean, that's appalling. That's another human being.
If such a possibility were ever to become a technological and biological reality, it would certainly change the definition of what it means to be human. A less contentious use for human cloning technology has already brightened the horizon for people who, either due to a birth defect or accident, are disfigured. The cloning of human cells in petri dishes and test tubes to form skin and cartilage is currently under research and development, which could make it possible to create human ears, noses, and replacement skin for grafting onto burn victims. In addition, there has been very promising research into the treatment of diabetes, heart disease, and liver failure, among other treatments, whereby actual organ tissue may be cloned to replace a failing heart or kidney or pancreas or liver.
There will be attempts made in the not-too-distant future to try to clone human organs, because I think all of us recognize that there are thousands of people in this country who die because a liver is not available, or a kidney, or a heart. And I think you will see a serious attempt to clone human organs And I think that's a good target to have, so that people who do need to have an organ replaced will be able to have it replaced.
Cloning human tissue and organs is not nearly the same as cloning a full-term human being. While the techniques and procedures are essentially the same in the beginning, they differ tremendously thereafter. At present, while this technology is not yet available, it is within sight as research into the area continues.
When we meet again in 5 years to talk about our progress, I think we'll be at the point of having demonstrated in animals the utility of combining cellular immortalization with telomerase, the generation of differentiated cells from embryonic stem cells, and the customization of those cells and tissues by nuclear transfer to produce cells that your body won't reject, that will integrate into your dysfunctional organ and repair it and cure your degenerative disease.
That would be an acceptable way of cloning. Anything to save a human life, anything to enhance the quality of life is permissible because you are enhancing life, not making life. So cloning a heart or a liver or a kidney or anything that saves a person would be permissible. Cloning an exact duplicate of a human being from scratch would be unacceptable.
Our interest is to take the biology inherent in cloning animals and learn how to clone cells and tissues for therapy. That's our interest, where there is a compelling medical need and no other route to treat these degenerative diseases without the use of cloned cells.
Now, the problem here is that it's a distraction from the fact or from the cause of why people are needing heart transplants and kidney transplants in the first place. It's because of poor diet. It's because of use of incredible amounts of toxic pesticides and other chemicals in our food supply.
Technology is, however, advancing at mind-boggling speed. It appears that limited cloning may well become first a legitimate treatment, as research for the growing of skin cell tissue or organs seems to have a bright future. However, full-term human cloning would always be a prospect just beyond the horizon that some scientists argue is a necessary next step in the evolution of science. As another way of enticing public support for their cause, advocates of human cloning have proposed to someday be able to take a 65-year-old person and turn the age of that person back to the infant state. At first sight, it would not appear so, since Dolly was cloned from a 6-year-old ewe, and it was recently discovered that Dolly has features of an older ewe than her true age, which might make her a young sheep in an old sheep's body.
One of the interesting findings that have been published recently is the observation that Dolly's telomeres are a little shorter than you would expect from a 2.5-year-old sheep. The telomeres are caps on the end of chromosomes, and they're supposed to protect the chromosomes from erosion, from being nibbled away at the ends. And what we're finding is that Dolly has inherited that life history, that her telomeres are as short as you might expect from perhaps an 8 or 9-year-old sheep.
With all of these foreseen and unforeseen dangers and consequences that human cloning may have, it's perhaps not surprising that governments around the world have placed a total ban on cloning human beings, have banned any research on human embryos, or have banned government funding for any human cloning research. However, some say that those scientists, politicians, and religious clergy who have strongly argued against human cloning are simply fanatical and hysterical naysayers who are trying to stop the inevitable. The bioethicist movement, which began in the 1970s, attempts to bring both sides of the debate to the table for discussions based on logic and reasoning instead of ignorance and emotion. This is done in the hope that ultimate resolutions and regulations governing such new technology would not suffocate scientific advancements and the pursuit of knowledge.
My job as a bioethicist, and I think I'm a little bit different than the rest, is not to sensationalize it, but try to get people to practically think through what it actually will be. If you go back to test tube babies, very alarmist phrase, just like genetic engineering, in the early 70s, 78% of people were against creating test tube babies. And it's a very good thing that they got educated. Now, 50,000 babies have been created in this country alone through assisted reproduction.
When you talk about in vitro fertilization, you're still talking about the equation including a male and a female, an embryo and an egg from a male and a female that is being created at that time with God's help. You're not talking about actually cloning an individual from scratch where the male and female bonding is non-existent. Once man takes the position that he can create life in his image, he becomes God himself. And when he becomes God himself, he starts to believe that he can do no wrong. He starts to believe that he is the beginning, or she, for that matter, is the beginning and the end of all things. And we could end up destroying the world and having no human beings left on this earth.
If one takes the view that God created us and therefore that we ourselves take part in, if you like, his creative process, some people suggest that cloning is therefore okay. The idea being that he made us and therefore if we make others, we're just following through. When we break out of begetting, procreating into manufacture, we may want to use the word creation for both, but it's creation in a very different sense. It's difficult to see how you can put these two kinds of creation in the same category.
As stewards of creation, this technology may well be desirable as a potential cure for a variety of diseases or for the treatment of dysfunctional organs. But serious debate concerning the control of this technology is equally desirable. If the moral and ethical aspects of scientific and medical technology are not recognized, the technology may very well redesign the designers.
There were people that thought mosquitoes carried HIV. And it's a good thing we didn't make public policy based on that ignorance, because it would kind of validate the ignorance and prejudice. Well, in the same way, we don't want to make public policy based on ignorant things that people might believe about cloning, because it would validate the ignorance. So we need a time for people to kind of be educated, I think. And the word, it's even difficult to talk, because the word a clone or cloning has such a powerful emotional response, you can hardly get past that word.
Plainly, we're just at the very beginning of an explosion in which we're going to be 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 times more able to do these things than we are now. And so this is the great time to be having this conversation as we try and get a policy framework in place, what we do and don't want. But developing a policy framework for these things. So the Europeans have some basic frameworks in place. Here in the States, I think we have very little of a policy understanding within which to constrain these developments.
Can a line be drawn that allows scientists to continue to conduct research, make medical and scientific advancements, and cure disease, but that remains within a boundary which does not compromise our humanness?
I don't think under the present state of knowledge of human genetics and technology that we should be attempting to clone human beings. I think that in the area of genetics, we have certain major goals that should be fulfilled. We have an obligation, I believe, to pursue the field known as gene therapy. In other words, the field that will be able to either alter or provide genes that will correct certain diseases that occur in man. And I think that the science of genetics is largely focused in that area.
Perhaps as long as the possibility exists for humans to succumb to misguided conscience, cloning technology should be put on hold, or very firm rules should govern its research.
We need to be sure that the scientists and the scientific community have earned our trust, and I don't see that that has happened. I don't see that the scientists have ever proven themselves worthy of having a technology this advanced and being able to use it in an ethical manner that is not going to be dangerous, that is not going to infringe upon people's rights. I look at technologies that right now are also fairly new, that are being abused. For example, the issue of genetic engineering. There's a big red flag right there.
I think that there's corruption in any field. I mean, there are great people, and there are people that are somewhat corrupt in any field. Science is no different. I mean, I think that the society does have the concept that scientists are purer than other people, and they're omniscient, and for that reason, they can't do, they can do no wrong. But there are all kinds of people that go into science, and they are corruptible. But the majority of scientists are honest, hardworking people that are just trying to move the field ahead and find out things that will better a better life, better lifestyle for people.
The question here is, can you really hold the line between negative eugenics and positive? And the answer is no. You might as well say it on the front end. I call this the Viagra argument. One of the problems of talking about this is that there's lots of stuff going on in animal labs all around the country and around the world, and no one's talking because no one wants to give their secrets up, because there's all kinds of money, investors coming in, there may be Nobel Prizes. It's kind of like all the companies that are doing the gene research for profit. No one's talking to each other anymore. And there's got to be some kind of context that you put this in to make it make sense. Because if you just sort of focus on the science fiction gee whiz case and ignore all these other ways, then it's not really wise.
So there's another round of public debate and policy debate that needs to happen. And we just think that needs to be handled very openly. And I think one of the lessons of the situation we have in Britain on GM foods is that some of the companies who were developing products to launch over here weren't open early enough. They didn't warn the public through the media of what was coming. So what came then happened as a surprise in an environment in Europe which has been very much colored by the terrible experiences over BSE, the mad cow disease, where, the regulatory system failed to identify and then deal quickly enough with a potential problem. And that has somewhat undermined the British public's and broader European public confidence in science and regulations.
Public confidence is eroded by these odd cases. But on the other hand, what happens the next day when someone comes out with an antibody that attacks breast cancer? Then public opinion rises again. I mean, it's okay.
By being very open and very honest about what you're trying to do, that there are risks, what those risks are, but also what the benefits are, so that society at large feels it has been involved and informed in the process of and how this in the end gets used for human benefit. I think if we do that right, this time we'll actually have something that everybody feels comfortable with.
For the present, heated debates will continue in the effort to arrive at a cloning consensus. Most people believe cloning human tissue and organs for an immediate benefit in the health and quality of life of individuals may well be appropriate, as long as strictly defined regulations overseeing the technology are in place. At the same time, there seems to be an equally universal distaste for cloning full-term human beings. Such disfavor seems to go above and beyond the reasons that society first cited in opposition to in vitro fertilization. The objections have more to do with the rights of cloned individuals and the moral, ethical, and spiritual implications of this new technology, which have not yet been satisfactorily resolved. Given the profound implications of human cloning on the future of humanity, there's an immediate need to inform, educate, and debate these issues to determine how far we're willing to allow this technological and biological reality to proceed in the name of science.